time to build our detail view or our retrieve view for the individual blog post. So if I come in here and define post model detail view, we're going to take in a request and we're going to return render, request, template, and context, just like we've seen before. And then I'm going to copy the context from the one below it. And we're going to call this detail view instead of list view. And then the context itself we'll just leave empty for now. And we will definitely come back to that context. So before we can get this detail actually working, I'm going to go ahead and jump into my URLs and I'm going to make a URL for it. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the list view, paste below, and I'm just going to say 1. So I'm just going to put the number 1 with a slash here. And I want to definitely import this view into my URLs. So we'll go ahead and actually put it into a parentheses import. So then we have them listed out right here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put my detail view right there, and I'm going to call the name detail. Okay, so I've got my post detail view here now, so let's go ahead and jump into it by going into blog 1 and hit enter. I got my viewed template does not exist. That's good because we did not create the file yet. So let's go ahead and create it, and we'll do detailview.html, and I'll just say blog title or post title rather. And that's all we'll leave it as right now. We save that, refresh. Now we've got post title. So we actually have a place to see some sort of detail here. So let's actually think about how we can do this detail. Now using query sets, or actually more specifically getting an object, so a model manager for the actual post model, we'll say object equals to post model.objects.get, and we'll say ID equals to 1. Remember how our URL was 1? That's what we're doing, ID equaling to 1. So the context will say object is equal to object. So obj is the same. So now in our detail view, we have the template context that we can use. Let's go ahead and jump that open. So we can go object.title, and we can save that. And now in our view, we see that that's the context is object. And now if we refresh in here, it shows us new post. So we actually are able to get this object. Well, what if we did something that didn't exist? Save that and refresh. I get this object does not exist. Well, this does happen from time to time. Like a user goes to a different URL to a page that doesn't exist, but it's a page that might eventually exist. So we can actually import another shortcut called get object or 404. So to do this, we simply just add object being get object or 404, and it takes in the model as the first thing, and then the query that we actually want to do on it. So I said ID equals to 1. I save this and refresh. The post comes through. If I do ID is equal to 100, I refresh, and it says page not found. So that's a really simple and easy way to grab that object or run a 404 error versus what we had before, which caused an exception block. That's the way that I want to tell you how to do it, but there are 2 other ways that you actually can do it. So object, we could do it in a try block. So object equals to get object, post model.objects.get, and we said ID equals to 100 before, and that raised an exception. So we can handle that exception with this and just raise an HTTP 404. These 4 lines and this 1 line do the exact same thing. So I'm going to comment it out. Now, one more way to do the exact same thing is by saying query set equals to post model.objects.filter ID equals to 100, and they'll say if not QS.exists, meaning this query set doesn't exist, meaning that filter does not actually have anything that's in there, we can then raise the 404, raise HTTP 404. Otherwise, we can say object equals to QS.first. So some query set stuff here that allows you to actually grab that object. These 5 lines do the same thing as this. Realistically, line 28 would probably want to say and QS.count is equal to 1 or is not equal to 1. So if there's more things than just that one ID. This one you may use in other cases, right? So if there's something like you wanted to do title instead of ID, you would use this method. That's kind of the general idea of what you would go for in the long run, and then you would just say object equals to none here. So we've got a lot of stuff here versus what can be done in this one line, which makes it really easy for our views in particular. I'm going to go ahead and comment this one out. I just wanted to mention those two different ways on how to do it because, like in programming, there's a lot of ways on how to do it, but I just wanted to show you that when you look at other people's code, you might see it done in one of those three ways, and it's going to make sense for whatever that project calls for or whatever method that developer ends up using. So the exception block, there's nothing wrong with it inherently. It does actually work. And there's even more robust ways to call out that exception. But in our case, this is what we want, and that's going to be nice and easy. So we save that and refresh. Now we go ahead and actually can work with that particular object. Now this is an okay detail view. It's not quite done because we explicitly wrote the ID for the actual model. So what that means is we have to update how our URL works. Right now our URL just uses the number 1. So what we want to do is have a more dynamic URL function that can like pass in, or we can change the URL, but this view will still handle it. So if we actually open up joincfe.com/guides and click on the common Django URL expressions or common regular expressions for Django URLs, we are going to go ahead and look at these examples here. So what you see is we already seen something like this. That's our list view. You haven't seen these. These are class-based views, but work very similar. If you've ran through the class-based views project we have, then you have seen these. But if you haven't, that's okay. You can go back and look at them later. The one that we are really interested in, or the two that we're interested in, are these two right here. Notice that they have this weird little pattern in here that is associated to that URL. So that weird little pattern is called a regular expression. And this whole regular expression is looking for a matching URL. We've already seen that a little bit, but I'm not going to show you everything about regular expressions. We do have a course on joincfe.com/projects that's called regular expressions, or it's Python regex. And that is right here. So Python regular expressions, or regular expressions in Python. And you can learn about how regular expressions work, but we made this guide so it's nice and easy for you to use something like object ID. So that's what we're going to be doing, is object ID to actually get the ID of the model itself. So in here, I'm going to put two parentheses and do $P, and I'll just say ID and then do /D+. So that is almost identical to this order one, but instead of order, I said ID. So this right here is called a keyword argument, and that keyword argument is going to be passed into our request. If I save this and go back into our project, I get an error here saying that post model detail got an unexpected keyword argument ID. So that means we have to put something in the value for ID. So I can say ID equals to none, or I can just write it out as a normal argument and say ID. I like having it as a keyword argument so I know that it is a keyword argument. I refresh in here and that number 1 is still coming through. If I change this to 32 or 23, it's still coming through. It doesn't actually matter. The actual ID is there and it's running. So if I print out ID, what I will see is if I refresh in here, it's going to actually print out whatever was passed here. If I try anything other than a number, it gives me this 404 error, and that's because our pattern does not match. That's something that's really nice about regular expressions that you may want to learn more about. Okay, so now that we've got this ID, I can actually dynamically call it here, and I can just run it off of the actual object ID. So I save this, I undo that print statement, and then I refresh in here, and I get page not found. So we've got this 123 is not there. If I go to 1, it's there. If I go to 2, it's there. If I go to 3, it's also there, and then 4, and so on. So that is really nice. It actually is showing us that particular URL. And since we have that, we can actually update our list view to do so, to actually have our lists being linked to our URLs. So I could come in here and just say something like this. I'm gonna link in the title, and I'll just say /blog/object.id, and I'll get rid of these other things. So that gives me a link to that actual URL. I save that, refresh in here, and now I can actually click on these things right here. Really cool, nice and useful for us, and an easy way to actually link things together. And our URLs are now working for our detail view. Okay, so one thing I want to actually take a second to talk about is this is not the only way to write URL patterns. There are other ways, so I'm just going to go ahead and paste in those other ways here so you guys can see them, although I'm not going to go through them, at least in full detail. So here's a couple other that actually would work for our blog ID. So if we save it, refresh in the list itself, we will see, oh, blog is not a registered namespace. So we want to make sure inside of our URLs, we actually come in here and say that our namespace, and we say comma namespace equals to blog. We save that, and then in our actual, I'll explain this whole thing in just a second. So we refresh, and now we've got the link 3 times. 2 of them actually work, 1 of them doesn't. So let's actually look back at this, the list view itself. So this right here is a dynamic URL, much like our actual URL functions. This reverses it, looks for a namespace, and then looks for the URL detail. So the URL detail name, first of all, we wrote that namespace. We could change that to whatever we like. And then if we look inside the app, the names that are corresponded to here is how that part is rendered. And then this last one, object get absolute URL, that is a method that you will often see on models.py itself inside of here, an actual class, an instance method for that class. But we're not going to go ahead and do that. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and leave these commented out. It's really just for your own reference. It's not to show you every little aspect of how URLs and templates are routed. So that for stuff like that, you're going to want to definitely check out a project in particular because it goes into detail on all of those things because the context makes sense to do so. All right, so that's it for the post model detail view. We were able to do a lot in here. So in the next one, what we're going to do is actually create a form and then do a create view. If you have any questions on this, let us know. Otherwise, let's keep going.